What's up, world? It's your boy, Mike Muse. Welcome to the Conversation, the Mike Muse Show. And I am so excited to be in conversation with my next guest. This is a day for me just to learn because as I was exploring the idea of Zora Neale Hurston, I thought I knew everything I needed to know. And by that, all I needed to know was she was from Eatonville and that she wrote this incredible book, Their Eyes Are Watching God. I was like, oh, done deal. And then I started looking at the documentary from this incredible director, Tracy who I'm about to interview in just 1 second. And when I was watching it, I was like, oh my God, I know nothing about Zora Neale Hurston, nor do I know anything about anthropology. And I call myself a cultural anthropologist, just started that terminology recently, folks. So just FYI. And I was like, she is so fascinating. Why don't we know more about her? Why don't we know more about her anthropological studies? Why don't we know more about the history of anthropology and how it got its start? I'm going to let Tracy take that over as I just learned. So I'm no expert to talk about that. And I'm just like, what is happening? I'm like, this is why this documentary matters. And so without further ado, if you think you know Zora Neale Hurston, if you've ever read the book Their Eyes Are Watching God or any other book by her, you think you have an idea of who she is, you literally have no idea. I think she is one of now, and this is by now meaning 10 minutes ago, I believe she is the most important person to American culture and to American history, and then by that, Black culture, because as you always hear me say, folks, Black culture is American culture and is American history. So to lead us basically into this lecture, folks, get your notebooks out. This is going to be a very non-traditional interview because I'm taking my notes too as well. Ladies and gentlemen, the incredible director of the documentary, Zora Neale Hurston Claiming Space, an American Experience, Tracy Heather Strain. What is happening, Professor?
Hi, you can call me Tracy. It's so great to be here. What a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. I hope I can live up to that.
Oh, I'm sure you can, because as my audience knows me, I know my audience, none of us know the true story of Zora Neale Hurston after watching this documentary. And I say that with respect, audience. I literally learned from this documentary a whole new appeal. And I'm just so mad, Tracy, that we've only been focusing on the book, Their Eyes Are Watching God. And I'm not discrediting that book. It is an incredible book. But I've always viewed this book as fiction and no other than fiction. I didn't know she studied with the most prominent father of anthropology, Francis Boas, right? Like all these things I just didn't know. So with that being said, let me just start with you. And the reason I did call her professor is because she's currently sitting at Wesleyan College, where she is a professor, currently discussing documentary work and other anthropological dope cultural issues. So how did you discover Zora Neale Hurston from this capacity in a place of you want to examine further outside of the book?
I was in the grocery store one day and I got a call on my cell phone from Cameo George, who is the executive producer of the PBS series American Experience. That's run out of WGBH in Boston. I used to live in Boston, and we've done other films for them. And she asked me if I was interested in doing a film for them about Zora Neale Hurston. And that they wanted to make a film that focused on her anthropology. And I was like, okay, of course I want to do a film about Zora Neale Hurston, number one. Number two, anthropology. I have to say, I'm like you, I'm new to anthropology is a new thing for me. And I have to admit that maybe unlike you, I actually had not read Their Eyes Were Watching God. As some people may know, I made a film about Lorraine Hansberry that came out a couple of years ago. I kind of lived in Lorraine Hansberry world for a long time in my life, and so there wasn't room for anybody else. But Zora Neale Hurston is someone I really wanted to know, and I was embarrassed that I hadn't read Their Eyes Were Watching God. We actually have 2 copies in our house, and neither of us had read it, my husband nor I, who was also my filmmaking partner. And so this was the opportunity. It's, it's a perfect opportunity. I get to learn about Zora Neale Hurston. I get to make a film about an important Black woman. I don't have to raise the money for it. So unlike Hansberry. So I was delighted to say yes. So that's how it started.
I know Cameo approached you to do this, but what was it about it that said yes for you? Since you really weren't familiar, what was it that said, you know what, I'm going to go down this road of doing a documentary?
I knew Zora Neale Hurston was an important figure, of course, right? I knew she'd written The Rise
Yeah.
of Barach and God. I remember when Alice Walker, I'm old enough to remember when Alice Walker rediscovered her, right, and brought her to the public. I wasn't old enough to I wasn't literary focused at that time, but I had just either taught a class or just started doing the research for a class I was going to teach in my documentary history class that was going to focus on the history of Black documentary filmmakers. And I had started research. I subsequently have done a lot more research. And I actually expressed to Cami on the phone, this is so interesting that you called me because, there are some people that think that she's one of our earliest documentary filmmakers. I've come now to believe she's probably she's probably our earliest female ethnographic filmmaker, right? Because I think that if you kind of, depending on how you define documentary actually was a term that was just coined in 1926, and she was doing her filming in 27. So I don't think that she was thinking of herself as a documentary filmmaker, but what she was doing with that camera was collecting imagery of Black people as part of her ethnographic research. And so we're blessed to see this material that was saved. There were other people filming before her, filming Black people's lives, but for whatever reason, their stuff has disappeared, like a lot of our history, right? It just didn't get saved, or it got thrown out, or whatever. But her films were saved, and we are all the better for them.
So let's break this down, audience. I want to go through some fundamentals before I talk more about Zora Neale Hurston. So I'm going to break down first just anthropology, right? Talk to us about, it's a broad question, I'll guide you along, but talk to us about what is the study of anthropology, and before Zora Neale and her colleagues and cohort got into place, what was anthropology used for? Because when you stated in the documentary, it blew my mind away on why anthropology was created. So what is anthropology and why was it created?
Okay, so anthropology is considered the study of human societies and cultures and their development. So that's like a boring technical definition. But for this discussion, it's really important to understand that in our world history, people in Western societies went off into other lands on their boats and things and discovered people, right? And those people tended to be brown or quote unquote yellow, different peoples. And they thought they were so interesting and they were so different and unusual. And so these people that were traveling and seeing these things, they would write diary articles about them, describing them from their Western lands, right? So, and it's a time of hierarchies, and these early social scientists start categorizing people. I mean, anthropology was a science then, and these scientists were categorizing people as savage, barbarian, and civilized. Guess who's where, right? So
Black and brown people.
Yeah. And then you have these kind of middle people that, sort of have these different, they maybe wear different clothing and have different ways that they perceive as in between, right? And they saw it as a progression that people would go through. And so I learned this actually years ago because I worked on a series called Race, the Power of an Illusion. I had the privilege of actually interviewing Lee Baker twice in my life, and the first time was for that series. And so that's when I was first introduced to that idea of this, this notion of, savage, barbarian, and civilized. Zora Neale Hurston discovers anthropology at Barnard College.
Well, hold on, before we get to Zora.
Okay, you might say anthropology.
Now, okay. So I'm going to say anthropology for a second. So it's a study of that outline. These also were individuals, audience, of what was called armchair anthropologists, where a lot of individuals actually didn't go out to these different geographical places and spaces to what Tracy just outlined. And so basically they were assessing and notating what these human species were in savagery and barbarianism based upon other readings they had did without having to experience it itself. But then also too, Tracy, talk to us about how anthropology was used in America specifically for the justification? And what was anthropology used to justify?
Yeah. So in the United States, this notion of a hierarchy and whether people are human or not is used as a justification for slavery. Lee Baker tells us about that in our documentary. And then when slavery goes away, this is the story of our country. There's always a way, the position of Black people changes over time. One of my favorite films, by the way, is Marlon Riggs' Ethnic Notions, where I first was introduced to the concept that our society changes their perception of Black people to suit the white view of us, right? So before the Civil War, we're docile and happy. After the Civil War, we're dangerous, right? Anyway, getting back to anthropology, once slavery is dismantled, well, if we're saying that they're not people and now they are people, anthropology is used to justify segregation. And so there's always science is fraught with white supremacy.
Yeah.
And so it's always this is an interesting thing about science, and actually almost any academic inquiry. It depends on who's asking the question and what questions they ask. And so if you ask questions in a certain way, you're going to get most people ask the question to get the answer they want. And
it's about the data and the collecting of data and really your sample pool, and then the question and the inquiry and audience. Right. And what Tracy is talking about when it comes to science is used for systematic racism that was existing because it was this narrative and notion about if all men are created equal, then technically there couldn't be any slavery. So then they had to use the study of anthropology in order to dismantle the narrative of all men are created equal by showing Black people were of a different species, so they weren't equal, in order to keep slavery intact. But then once slavery got abolished, then they had to use anthropology for Jim Crow and then segregation to justify again because they're separate. And then Tracy, what you guys did so great in this documentary was really show through physical dynamics of how they were trying to prove it by the different instruments. Talk to us about the tools and instruments that were used to prove that Black people were different and other species to support Jim Crow.
Science likes to pride itself on using data to make to develop its theories and hypotheses. And so what kind of data were they collecting about people? They started measuring people's heads. And there's a whole body of work about this and that critiques this. And, I used to know more of it before, but
no.
People were using these measurements to try to say that this group, and usually it's the people considered down, it's always the people considered down at the bottom, the savage types, were there. See, you could see the ridge of their skull. Oh, that's lesser. Our brains are bigger and highly developed, and they would find specific skulls. The thing is, they could probably find skulls of all different groups. It could have said the same thing, but they would pick the skulls that supported, their particular arguments about things. And it's so problematic. And there's a lot of science that's like this, and a lot of different groups. There were a lot of people working, not just anthropologists, but other people, different names like Josiah Nott, and they've written these books, Types of Mankind. There's just so much being generated. Yeah. When people today say, why are you people always bringing up race? Well, there's a lot of literature that white people generated about race. I remember on this other project, one of the books that just captured my attention the title was Negromania. And it was written by white people about analyzing Black people based on measurements and so-called, descriptions by other people who didn't even sometimes encounter Black people, or so they've only seen Black people as enslaved people, right?
Exactly. So audience, hold that note about the measurement and the tool, because I'm going to come back to that in a second. I'm building a story here, Tracy, right? Because I got to keep it linear from an audience who won't have the chance to see this documentary yet, because this documentary is going to air Tuesday. So this coming Tuesday. So as you're listening, I really want them to get the understanding of what to be prepared for. So then now, so keep the audience in your notes, keep the tool in mind, right? So now because now in the backdrop of all this, Zora Neale Hurston is Eatonville, Florida, brilliant, smart, ahead of her time, ahead of her class. So she's learning, getting educated. Now at this time, she moves up to Barnard College, right? But while she's at Barnard on the teacher's track, there's a guy named Francis Boas. I hope I'm saying his name correctly, right?
Franz or Franz Boas, yeah.
Franz Boas. Talk to us about Franz Boas and who he is, because once I now built this foundation, now I can start inserting Zora Neale Hurston, because I need an audience to understand the importance of who Zora is outside of their eyes are watching God. But in order to understand the importance of it, I want my audience to understand the foundation of anthropology and the work that she was doing in it. So talk to us about Francis Boas, because he's a really important figure to this space.
Right. Once Zora Neale Hurston decided to leave Howard and went to New York and transferred into Barnard College, she wrote a paper in an anthropology class. Someone encouraged her that, like, you're taking so much literature, take an anthropology class. She did it, she wrote a paper, and suddenly she's summoned to the office of Franz Boas, one of the world's most famous anthropologists. And he's famous because he was literally changing the field at the time that Zora Neale Hurston was encountering him. He is considered the father, and there's a patriarchal term, I know, of modern anthropology and American anthropology. Like British anthropology is different. And he was also considered an important anti-racist figure. Franz Boas thought that cultures are not existing in hierarchies, that these cultures existed in their own space. They weren't evolving into any other place. They were their own thing, right? And he went about trying to change the field. He actually faced a lot of resistance, but it finally became accepted. He did a variety of things to make it work out, that it has become accepted way of thinking, and he got the position at Columbia. And then here comes Zora Neale Hurston, who's written this paper that must have been something that was probably had the richness of her past in there, details, cultural details that made him say, this is a discipline for you, anthropology. And Zora Neale Hurston was aware that he was this important anti-racist and this preeminent scholar. And she is a part of a group of people in New York that are trying to change the perceptions of African Americans, one, and two, she realizes that anthropology gives her license to study her own people.
So audience, what Franz Boas was, he was dismantling the idea, what we just said earlier in this conversation, was that how anthropology was used to justify slavery and how anthropology was used to justify segregation. And Sir Boas, who says, no, that is not true. I'm going to dismantle that idea and notion, formulate a new version. That's when Tracy was talking about modernization of anthropology, formulate this new modernization of anthropology that does not support this narrative, which is the term anti-racist that exists. Franz Boas had people, and I'm learning this from the documentary, folks. I'm no scholar. I'm just good at, synthesizing information. In this documentary, folks, that Tracy does so well, she talks about how people were flocking from Europe and across the country to really sit underneath Boas's tutelage and professorship and to learn about this space and the importance of it, which is why it was important then when Zora Neale comes into place, that not only does she understand culture, but she understands our people, but she has a fascination with it. And essentially with Tracy in the documentary, folks, it outlines, I cannot wait for you guys to see this Tuesday on PBS. It really outlines how he deputized, I'm using their words in the documentary that you use, Tracy, he deputized individuals to go out. So Zora was deputized to go out into the field, i.e. Black folk in areas in the rural South, in the Caribbean, to document the study of Black people, to really understand the origins and aspect of it. And so I hope I got that part right, Tracy, because now I want to really lean into Zora next.
Okay.
Did I get all the other stuff right up to this point?
Yeah, it sounds good to me. And so in the film, we use her words out of order. So when when it comes time in her chronology for Mules and Men to come out, we do talk about Mules and Men, but I also grabbed things early. And one of the things I grabbed early was this idea that comes from Mules and Men, that it was anthropology that gave her the license to feel like she could study her own people, the culture she saw. So here's a woman who, as a young girl, was very drawn to the general store at Joe Clark's general store, the porch where people gathered to tell stories and tell lies and share folklore and gossip. And she was one of those kids who wanted to be around adults and listen to this stuff. As one of the people say in the documentary, she seems to have been an innate cultural anthropologist as a kid. And so suddenly all this stuff from Eatonville, which I suspect some of it was in that paper, is suddenly she realizes this isn't just, oh, this great stuff from Eatonville. I can study this. I can go look at this. And so she says, it took the spyglass of anthropology for her to be able to see her own people. And that's what she sets out to do. Boaz raises some money from two sources, a Black man, the man who's now known as the person who came up with Black History Month, and then a white
Carter G.
female
Wilson,
anthropologist.
correct,
Yeah, Carter G. Wilson, right? And so I love the fact that it's a Black man and a white woman anthropologist who put up the first money for her first trip. We don't say that, but I hope people should be able to pick that up.
Which is why I think it's so important, Tracy, how you guys connected that dots. And for me, that's when I was like, oh my God, like, that's why I could not wait to talk to you. I'm just like, why don't we not know more about Zora? Because really, when I use the word deputize, well, when you guys talk about the word deputizing in the documentary, again, folks, I'm only learning from the documentary, and you will be a scholar too after you watch the documentary, just like I am, about dismantling and countering the narrative and the notion of looking at what we called earlier, Trace, in our conversation, in the documentary point, you called them armchair anthropologists. So those white men who were making this discourse and scientific and quotation mark studies on Black people who had never went to study Black people at all, right? And so I think that's why it was important. I think as Zora as a figure, she was the one who was a part of this new modern anthropology who could go into these communities. So talk to us about the importance of that, right? Like the importance of what Zora was doing when she went to Harlem. An audience, just for geographical purposes, some of you may not be familiar with Barnard, it's all in New York City. So Barnard is right in New York City, right next to Columbia, and Columbia is in Morningside Heights. Harlem, it's all together. That's why she's associated with the Harlem Renaissance. And so just to kind of give you some geography narrative on how this works. So why it was important for her to go into Harlem, where she first began the work, to help reshape this narrative of Black culture.
Zora Neale Hurston first anthropological research was a part of a study that was being done under Boaz and Melville Herskovitz. And she was tasked with conducting anthropometry. And that was the measuring of people's heads. So Zora Neale Hurston is tasked to go out and measure Black people's heads. And the story, we know this story because of Langston Hughes. He wrote about the fact that Zora Neale Hurston stood in the corner at Lenox, and I can't remember which street, but to measure people's heads. So she has to ask people's permission. And interestingly enough, he doesn't just say that she measures people's heads. He says she measures people's heads she found interesting, right? So Zora Neale Hurston was like picking interesting heads on top of everything. And she was so allegedly so charming and so convincing that people agreed. And she wasn't doing it to help prove that Black people were lesser. She's a part of this research just trying to show that head size has nothing to do with intelligence or culture, any kind of attributes of allowing people to be on any hierarchies. And so it was said, now this work was being used in the opposite way to prove that people are alike. But as one of the individuals says in our documentary, Eve Dunbar, there's this history, of this negative history. So it would have been a big ask to have to ask someone, a Black person, to measure their heads. But she was charming and was able to get people to agree.
To me, that was the significance of her and her work, right? If you think about Boaz being this modern, father of modern anthropology to dispel, to be anti-racist, then Zora comes in. Her work is the foundation of disproving what common sense already knows. But folks, common sense wasn't common sense back then. And so what we know as common sense, she was the one, the forerunner, right, of undercutting what these white men and the colonizers were doing, which is to me why she is so significant to our history and to our culture. Talk to us about her ability, the idea of folklore, right? Like, why is that important to Black studies? Why is that important to Black culture? Why was it important for her to document folklore? Because not only did she stay in Harlem, but she traveled back to Florida and to Eatonville. Talk to us a little bit about the importance of that work that she was doing and why that work was important.
Zora Neale Hurston thought that Black culture was important, and part of Black culture is our folklore, the stories that we tell ourselves to make sense of the world. And Black folklore is quite rich, and she wanted to collect it because she saw it as significant, important, and she also saw it as connecting to the larger American narrative. Some of the stuff that's now considered American folklore is derived from African Americans, and there were people collecting folklore who were not Black. And Zora Neale Hurston, we don't get into this in the documentary, she had a real problem with their interpretations of folklore, and she also was. And another thing we don't get into is Black people weren't just getting folklore based on maybe connections to Africa and things were brought over. They also were interacting with white people, Scottish people, whoever was down there. And so folklore is a complex mix of different cultures. And so Zora Neale Hurston had trouble with a pair that was collecting folklore because she was like, no, this is actually coming from England. This isn't like, and so she was really meticulous about investigating and having people consider African American stories, religion, the way people made food, and really thought there was richness to it and importance to it, beauty as well.
But tell us the why, though, Tracy. Like, why, again, we're looking at this lens now from 2023, right? Where all of this seems so much common sense, right? But I really want to set this at this time, right? When this was like the 1920s, 20s, right? When common sense was not common. I really want to lean into the significance of now it seems so duh. So people and like, oh, why is that so thing? But in the 1920s, are you kidding me? That's why my head was exploding. Why it was important in the 1920s.
Sure. So there's a couple things going on, more than a couple. A couple's two, right?
Yeah.
But
I know what you mean.
So racism is quite rampant. I mean, think of 1919, one of the most bloody years in American history, where many Black people were murdered across the country, and massacres, basically. They were massacred in 1990. Bloody summer. And so the Klan is quite visible across the country, particularly in the South, as I understand it. And people were not thinking that Black people had culture in some cases. In other cases, they thought that Black people in America were a kind of degraded version of African greatness. There's a lot going on, and none of it's really good for Black people. And Zora Neale Hurston's part of a number of people that are in New York and other places who felt that with their art and literature and their research that they could do things to help offset society's perceptions of Black people. And so that was part of her motivation. Yeah.
And not only motivation, but the significance of the work and what she contributed to putting new data out there, right? And a new way of looking at the science of Blackness was almost audience, I'm about to be very loose with this, so plug your ears, Professor. The new science of Black people, right? Like in terms of like, I don't know if that's even a statement or a phrase, but for me, that's how I'm interpreting it. It's like she really helped formulate this science of Blackness, right? To which wasn't really being examined.
Right, but the I don't want to get ahead, but she was doing this stuff that's ahead of her time throughout the course of her life, but then she gets disconnected from it. So she doesn't, so it's one thing to be a path breaker, but then people need to be following you, but she gets disconnected. And so people don't even know about her in the future.
Talk about that. Yeah, so we're here. I do, there is a point I want to really talk about that I found so just beautiful in the story about when you say she was the first documentary, particularly Black female documentarian, I'm assuming you're alluding to when she had the conversation, she's able to follow the last living Black American to be enslaved. I think maybe that's what you're referencing to, but I do want to talk about that because I thought that was just such a beautiful piece. And I love the footage that you guys use. But before I actually probably want to end on that one, but to come back to that, I do want to get to that part about the break, because why do people like myself, right? And I don't pretend to be a scholar of anything or to be well learned on anything, right? But like I have some curiosity about things, and I did not know her significance. So why did that break happen, you think?
I think that happened, the break that caused Zora Neale Hurston to kind of disappear from our the culture is complicated, and I think that African Americans are also complicit in this as well. When Their Eyes Were Watching God comes out, it was critiqued very harshly by some prominent African American men. I think that Zora Neale's interest in being authentic and including her ethnographic research in books like Their Eyes Were Watching God was perceived as pandering to white people, the authentic dialect. She was trying to record it the way she heard it. And that put her out of favor with some people. There was a way that a lot of Black people did not want to be associated with the South, with ruralness. They were trying to be modern. They've migrated north. They see themselves as part of this new Negro movement, which she saw herself as a part of too. But she and Langston Hughes both actually were quite interested in Southern culture, and Zora, who is from the South, was unapologetically Southern, and was not ashamed of being from the South. And I think that there are aspects of her own personality and how she had some problems with people, which it's too complicated that we couldn't get into in the documentary. So I think there's a lot of things going on. And then just one of the scholars in our film talks about how the Negro is like no longer in vogue anymore. There's periods of time where people are interested in African American issues, and then there are times they're not. And so that started to be, we're in the Depression, the Great Depression, this huge economic downturn. And Zora Neale Hurston just kind of starts like not being someone who is celebrated. She does write an autobiography called Dust Tracks on a Road in 1942. So we're about to enter World War II, or maybe we've already entered. But anyway, that brings her some prominence. But I think that's probably the end of her positive prominence.
I loved, Tracy, Heather Strain, how you outlined that. And I mean, you and I could do a whole show on just unpacking all of that, right? How we can other each other, right? And sometimes we don't like to talk about the bad of us or what we deem as bad, or like, especially like the good Black versus the bad Black, right? And all these type of false narratives that come into our culture that we don't want to talk about, and not saying the quiet part out loud. And so I really feel like that, because audience, Zora does go into the rural South, right? And Zora was really big, which I think now is probably a good segue, Tracy. She was really big on recording the language as is, right? With the video and with the voice. And some people may not have liked that, to accept that that is the voice, right? And so she was very much literal in that sense, in that context. And I think that is how we get good data is to be literal. I love how you frame that, and that's a whole unpacking. So you got to come back for part 2, Tracy. But to end, I just love how you guys included in the documentary where you guys put in there the footage of where Zora, she documented it, the last living person to come to America on a slave ship. So we could just talk about that, the importance of that as we end. And I think that's enough to get this audience excited to watch this documentary premiering Tuesday on PBS.
Right. And can I add one thing before I tell you the
Sure.
story? Not only is this film premiering on television on Tuesday, but it's actually also premiering online. So if you're someone who likes to stream, this is you can stream it that day as well. And we're really excited
it's
about
on pbs.org, the PBS video app, starting at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
So Zora Neale Hurston goes down to Mobile, Alabama to travel to meet Cudjo Lewis, who was considered at the time one of the last people who was enslaved in Africa and was captured and brought to the United States on what is considered to be the last slave ship. We don't know for sure. It was illegal. Slavery was illegal when he came here, so it was a secret mission. That ship was called the Clotilda. And she spent a lot of time with him to hear his story, from being in Africa and living his life to capture, the whole thing is there. And she gained his trust over time, and he shared more and more of his story with her. And she was both recording it, as anthropologists did at the time, handwritten, her notes, trying to get his dialect down, the way he spoke things. His words were considered a mixture of African words and African American words and American words. And she was blessed to have had a motion picture camera, a film camera. And this was a rare thing to have at the time. Anthropologists did not use film. It wasn't important to them at the time. It was cumbersome, expensive, and they didn't feel like it got the level of detail that was required for their discipline at that moment. But we have these beautiful images of Zora Neale Hurston interacting with Cudjo Lewis. There's no sound, but he's chopping wood. You see him doing various things and, being welcoming. And we were just so excited to be able to bring the image and the story to the screen. So this is 1927 when she goes down. It's actually the second time she's met him, by the way. We don't get into that. But in 1931, she has written a book. It's called Barracoon, Barracoon. And she sends it out to get published, and no one will publish it unless she agrees to change the dialect, the way he speaks. They wanted it to be more palpable and more comprehensible, easier read, right? She refused. And that book, Barracoon, was not published until 2018. She never saw it published in her lifetime. All this work that she did, it's really wonderful that now she's finally getting some recognition. A couple years later, another book came out of her writings. It's called You Don't Know Us Negroes, and it has a collection of her essays. Some were published, some were unpublished.
Well, listen, Tracy, I can talk to you literally all day. You got to come back and unpack more of this goodness, and literally whatever documentary you do down the road, because you're brilliant. I love how you unpack things and how you explain the conversation. Thank you so much for this lecture. Been a conversation. It was literally awesome.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say, I don't do this by myself. A team of people help me. So
Tracy Had the Strain, produced by Randall McLaury, edited by Mark Douglas, executive producer Cameo George. Audience, you can tune in to see this. You won't be disappointed. I mean, there's so much more that we didn't even get to. Again, this Tuesday, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, PBS, the local PBS station, pbs.org, and the PBS video app. Tracy, thank you so much. Audience, until next time. Peace.